Journalist Glenn Greenwald says he's about to drop the biggest bombshell yet from NSA documents. Greenwald, of course, the journalist who helped the former National Security Agency contractor Ed Snowden leak those documents. Today marks 1 year since Ed Snowden hopped a plane to Moscow as he was facing federal espionage charges here in the United States. It all started in May of last year when the government contractor told the NSA he needed some time off for medical treatment. He soon left his home in Hawaii and headed to Hong Kong. There, Ed Snowden met with 2 journalists, one of them Glenn Greenwald. Snowden gave them classified data that he had taken from the NSA. Weeks later, some of it went public in the British newspaper The Guardian. Some of the biggest revelations from the leak: the government's bulk collection program, showing the feds had gathered the phone records of millions upon millions of Americans. It also shed light on the PRISM program, that collection of private information from Internet users, as well as a report accusing the NSA of spying on European government offices. The Justice Department charged Ed Snowden with violating the Espionage Act. The feds revoked his passport. Right now, he's living in Russia, pretty much out in the open, we're told, giving speeches and lectures. Glenn Greenwald recently wrote a book about the whole situation called No Place to Hide: The USA and the U.S. Surveillance State. And he's with us on the Fox News deck this afternoon. It's good to see you. Thank you.
Great to be here.
How's he doing?
He's actually doing really well. His assumption was that he would end up in a U.S. prison for the rest of his life, which is what made what he did so courageous. And yet he's free. As you said, he participates in the debate that he helped around the world to trigger, and he's extremely satisfied that he feels he did the right thing. And when you have a clean conscience, that provides a lot of happiness.
Why not come home and face this?
He would come home if he thought he could get a fair trial. The problem is that he's charged with this Espionage Act, which was written in 1917 by Woodrow Wilson, designed to criminalize dissent against World War I. And under that law, he is barred. He would be barred by a judge from coming and making the defense he'd want to make, which is, I did this because it was improper to conceal it and the public had a right to know. You're not even allowed to raise that as a defense, and his conviction and probably life imprisonment would be all but guaranteed.
You're about to release more from this list of documents, and from what I've read, we're going to learn the kinds of people, at least, that the NSA was targeting?
And some specific people as well. I mean, this is...
Individuals?
Yeah, individuals.
Like who?
Well, I can't break the story on your show as much as I would love to, but the story is imminent. But, you know, I think that is
what does that
the
mean,
question.
Imminent? Is that today? Is it tomorrow?
My colleagues at the office will kill me if I give you a specific time frame, because that puts great pressure on them. But it's really, really soon. And you know, I think that is the key to think about, is that we shouldn't think about powers we give to the government only when we like the people with that power or like how they're exercising it. The founders instructed us to think: do we want government to have power when people we don't trust are exercising it in ways we don't like? And we shouldn't want the government with the power to spy on us in the dark and with very little accountability.
How much concern that if you release this, others are compromised?
We have been extraordinarily careful about the documents we publish.
Well, lots of people disagree with you.
Well, I mean, the proof, though, is in the pudding. Edward Snowden gave us many tens of thousands of documents over a year ago, and in that time we published a very small percentage of those documents because, at his insistence, we only published that which the public needed to know to have a debate about surveillance without compromising any lives or putting people in danger. And I think, you know, if you look at how careful we've been, that shows you what kind of source this was.
You were on Bill Maher over the weekend, and we were talking about this ISIS group with others who are with them, obviously, and running to create a caliphate across the north of Iraq and Syria. And you said something to the effect of, who's worse, really, them or, in essence, the Americans who invaded or would invade? You equated our forces to terrorists.
Yeah, that's not actually what happened. I mean, the point that I was making is that there's this phrase, terrorism, that actually has very little definition. It doesn't mean really much of anything. It's a fear-mongering word that the government invokes every time it wants to justify its policy, from torturing people to putting people in Guantanamo without charges.
These people are terrorizing.
No, but okay,
I've seen the video.
No, but so
I mean, they chop people's heads off.
Yeah, and my point was that the United States and lots of other countries engages in some really severe violence as well. When we invaded Iraq, we called our invasion shock and awe. The purpose of it, Shep, was to do so much violence that we would terrorize the civilian population into submission, into surrendering. And we indiscriminately bombed Baghdad. We certainly didn't try and kill civilians, but huge numbers of civilians
we actually
were
didn't
killed
indiscriminately
by the Iraq
do that.
War.
They picked targets very carefully from my memory of it.
No, I mean, the image that the United States government likes to depict of war is this very clinical, focused bombing, and yet civilians die every time the U.S. military or other militaries are used because the military is a machine designed to destroy. And the point that I'm really making is that if we want to have policy discussions, we shouldn't use fear-mongering terms and just have the government scream terrorism every single time it wants to justify something. Of course, ISIS are horrible people doing horrible things. No civilized, rational person would dispute that. But I think there's a lot more complexity to the question than simply to say they're terrorists. That means we now have to go and fight them.
I watched the Maher thing, and I saw a member of the American military really quite upset with you because I don't know, it felt rightfully so at the time that you were equating them to terrorists, these men and women who really do enlist, most of the ones I know, to go fight for our freedom and to be good Americans.
I don't think anybody can question and even vehemently criticize decisions by our political leaders to send people to war, and nobody should hold the soldiers who are sent there responsible for that decision. And so the question of, is an invasion that's aggressive in nature and based on false pretenses of a sovereign country like Iraq terrorism, that has nothing to do with blaming the soldiers who are sent to that country by political leaders who they can't question but have to obey. I think everybody has learned in the United States to distinguish between political leaders and the soldiers when it comes to questioning and even condemning war decisions.
The process of getting this information to the public has been, I don't know, a messy one if controlled on some level. If you look back, what would you do differently?
I mean, I think that the task journalistically was extraordinarily difficult because you have so many pressures when you're handed many tens of thousands of top secret documents from the most powerful government in the world. You have on the one hand an obligation to be responsible in what you're publishing, not to put lives at danger, and on the other hand you have a responsibility to the public to make sure they're seeing the things that should never have been hidden in the first place. And then on top of that you have the responsibility of accuracy, the supreme journalistic obligation to make sure that what you're reporting is accurate and true. And so, sure, I could go back like any journalist. I'm sure you could look at broadcasts you did a year ago and say, I wish I had done this a little bit differently and said this a little bit differently. I just wondered
if specifically you could think of something that, man, I should have done that.
You know, no, I mean, on the whole, I think the debate that has been triggered around the world and that is sustained a year later, not just in the United States, but globally, about surveillance and privacy and the dangers of having governments use power in the dark has been a really healthy one. And on the whole, I'm really gratified by what we were able to achieve.
Do you spend any time worrying that people might have died in this?
No, and the reason is because, I mean, you know, it's like saying, do you worry that your last broadcast caused the death of people? If I said to you, maybe your last broadcast caused the death of people, you very rightly would say to me, well, how did that happen? What is it that I said that caused people to die and which specific people died? There's never evidence presented by anybody that.
But as you've heard before in these interviews, because I've seen most of them, we don't know when CIA people die.
Shep, I know
one very well who did things that he couldn't talk about for America, and he said, when I'm gone, you'll hear about a car wreck in Arizona, but that's not what happened.
I've heard people say all the time that Fox News puts men and women in war and danger by criticizing President Obama.
Well,
and before I believe that, I would say,
did MSNBC do that?
Yeah, well, that's my point. I would want to hear evidence before I believed any of those kinds of accusations about other journalists. And so, if people have evidence that we did that, I can guarantee you, if any of the stories that we published from these Snowden documents caused the death of anyone, people in the Obama administration would be running to the New York Times in order anonymously to plant that to discredit the journalism that we're doing. The fact that they haven't, that they can't point to any of these harms, means that no rational person should be willing to entertain those kinds of inflammatory accusations.
Has there been pressure on you not to release the names of those who were targeted by the NSA in this upcoming revelation?
Huge pressure.
What kind of pressure?
The NSA saying that we will be unveiling legitimate surveillance targets. And, you know, the J. Edgar Hoover FBI made the same argument to people in the 60s and 70s when they unveiled those kinds of surveillance programs that were targeting right-wing groups and anti-war leaders and civil rights leaders. They said these are genuine threats and you're going to be disrupting legitimate law enforcement. That's what the government always says when you expose their secrets or bring them onto transparency.
You've said that so many of these, the items within these documents have not been released because you used journalistic integrity and decided not to. But Ed Snowden has taught us that releases happen whether we want them to happen or not. To what level of concern that some of the information that you have might get out that doesn't need to be out?
Well, the really good thing is that Edward Snowden was a highly trained operative in how to protect sensitive electronic data from unwanted disclosures.
Well, that's not what you hear and read. I mean, I've seen pushback on the other side.
No, I mean, there's no question. He trained CIA officials on how to protect some of their most sensitive information electronically. And we have used the highest forms of encryption. The only people who have lost control of any NSA documents are the NSA and the GCHQ. We have never lost control of a single document. We've been extraordinarily careful with how we've managed this information.
And when you publish this information, will it come out in a newspaper, and then what happens next?
Yeah, it'll come out at the Intercept.
Have you talked to any of these people who've been targeted, or the kinds of people who've been targeted?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the reasons it took so long, is because we're not going to expose people as being NSA targets who don't want to be exposed. And there are people who don't want to be exposed, even though they think it was invalid because they feel it'll harm their reputation or compromise their privacy. But all the people on whom we're reporting consented to it. They participated in the story. They spoke on camera. We're publishing video.
Will we recognize these names and some of these people?
You will definitely recognize some of these names and some of these people.
From politics, from government, from what?
From a little of all of that.
Okay.
I can't give hints, but they're people who, when you see that they're the targets, you will see that they have nothing to do with terrorism, and that they are definitely people engaged in political activism that's controversial.
And it's imminent.
And it's imminent.
And we'll watch for it.
Very good.
Glenn Greenwald, it's nice to meet you. Thank you.
Great to be with you.